Welcome to this evening's Jewish Renaissance session on the Yiddishists, the third in our series run with the Lyons Learning Project, exploring lots of different elements of Yiddish popular culture. Today happens to be World Theatre Day, so we're exploring Yiddish culture, but particularly the Yiddish theatre from Whitechapel to Broadway. Popular culture at the turn of the 20th century benefited hugely from Yiddish-speaking immigrants. Those Yiddish theatres performed traditional as well as homegrown material and frequently used songs to engage with community life and the challenges of integration. So tonight we're going to travel between London's East End and New York's Lower East Side with two incredible theatrical guides. Dr. Vivi Lachs and Dr. Edna Nahshon will each speak to us for about 20 minutes before we open it up to you, our audience, for questions. So I'm going to bring each on in turn and I'll introduce as they go. And our first speaker, is that, as that cliche needs no introduction. I mean, I will introduce Dr. Vivi Lachs, but for those of you who've been with us so far in the series, you've met her before as one of our panelists in the Esther Kreitman lecture, and again last week, speaking with David Mazower. Vivi is a historian of the Jewish East End, most recently at Queen Mary's University. She's the author of Whitechapel Noise, with Jewish Immigrant Life in Yiddish Song and Verse, and she's also editor and translator of London Yiddish Town, East End Jewish Life in Yiddish Sketch and Story. As well as studying Yiddish culture as an academic, she also throws herself into performance. She's a theatre performer. She's a Yiddish pop singer with the bands Klezmer Club and Kat Shanis. She's director of the Great Yiddish Parade, and she's vice chair of the Yiddish Cafe Trust. So, Vivi, we're really excited to have you here today to talk about the London Yiddish theatre scene.
Thank you very much, Aviva. It's lovely to be here yet again. It's like if I think I don't know what to do on a Wednesday night, well, I don't anymore. It's been really fun to be part of this series and ongoing. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is I'm going to talk to you about the Yiddish theatre probably from around 1883, and that will be a date that will stick in a minute, to around the First World War. And what I'm going to look at is I'm going to look a little bit about what there was in London in terms of theatre land. I'm then going to look at some of the furious arguments that were happening about the Yiddish theatre and about the quality of the work that was going on in the Yiddish theatre. And then I will look at three songs from the Yiddish Music Hall, because as Aviva said, a lot of the material, especially, or any material, but specifically the song material, there was a lot of local material, and it said a lot about what was going on, and it's very interesting to look at for that. So I'm going to start in 1883, and the question is, what was happening before 1883 in London? Well, the community, the London East End community, was developing from 1881. People were sort of pouring in. And there were performances in Yiddish. There was not a professional Yiddish company, but there were performances in Yossel's pub and in the back hall of some community centre. There were all sorts of little performances all over the place. And this is a quote from a man who you'll hear about in a minute called Jacob Adler. And he said that when he came to London in 1883, there were 1,000 clubs. Wherever you looked, clubs, splits, shouting, quarrels, and before you knew it, a new club. So I'm going to share my screen now and show you a pin-up of that man. Let's just see if I can get to it. Can you see Mr. Jacob Adler there? Yeah, okay, so this is Jacob Adler. And in 1883, the importance of that date is that in Russia, they banned the Yiddish theatre. So any theatre companies that were in Russia were suddenly jobless, slack time. What were they going to do? Well, they travelled across Europe to and America, of course, to other Yiddish communities to set up the theatres. And he came with his wife, Sonia Oberlander, and a company of professional actors, and they arrived in London from Odessa in 1883. And a continuation of the quote that I just said about clubs, he came with a professional company, but he said they were a training ground for our acting recruits. These clubs, that is, the chief source of our theatrical merchandise. So what he did is he took his professional actors, he set up a music school and a theatre school, and he got sort of people coming in and dancing and being part of a chorus, and sort of professionalized a lot of amateurs that were either doing stuff already, and he brought new people in. And he set up a theatre called the Hebrew Dramatic Club in Princes Street in Whitechapel, and often called the Princes Street Club. And there's some posters for it on here. It was very popular and successful, and it played all sorts of material. And they played material that was like well-known material from Goldfaden, or who was the father of Yiddish theatre, and they played also some local material. Mainly the local material was songs in between acts and things, or one of the things they did was they declaimed a ballad from Morris Winchevsky as one of the things they put on the stage. So there was a range of material. But they got into trouble. And they got into trouble, Jacob Adler particularly got into trouble with someone who was his namesake, although he was older than him, which was the chief rabbi, Nathan Adler. And he got into trouble with Nathan Adler because the religious were really, really unhappy about what was happening on the Yiddish stage. Firstly, they were performing on Shabbos, or they're performing on Shabbos before Shabbos had gone out on the Saturday. And they were also doing things like using a chauffeur on stage and all these things. And Jacob was saying, like, it was like we were just constantly being got at. We were constantly having to check what we were doing. So they weren't a very happy company because of that, but they were certainly a developing company, and it really brought a lot of professionalism to the London Yiddish stage. However, there was a tragic end to this story, because around 4 years after it opened, during a performance, someone yelled fire. There was no fire, but someone yelled fire, and in the scramble and the stampede to get out, 17 people were trampled and died. It was the whole of the East End was in mourning, and Jacob Adler finally accepted money from Nathan Adler, who was trying to get rid of him anyway, and he and the whole troupe left London for America. So that's the beginnings, really, of the professional Yiddish theatre. What stayed was that there were some smaller places. There was a hall in Vine Street, and there was the Standard Theatre in Shoreditch. And the Whitechapel Pavilion was the theatre that really took most of the operettas and the other dramas that were going on. And here we can see something called Mein Weib's Man, my wife's husband. And this lasted for a long time. This went on until 1935. We're not going to get that far. We're only going to get to the First World War. But there were theatres, and they were playing plays, but they weren't just theatres in terms of what was happening on the Yiddish stage, because there were also musicals. I'm assuming that you're seeing the slides as they move, yeah? Yeah, great. And here are 3 musicals that there were, and they're all very different. So if you look on the right, where we see Sally Weisenfeind dressed up as a chassid. There was quite a lot of cross-dressing in the music hall, but almost all the cross-dressing by women was being a chassid and making fun of religious issues, or just like bringing up religious issues, actually. And we'll look at one a bit later. So that was what was called very grandly the York Minster Music Hall. It was in a little tiny scrubby street called Philpott Street, and it was the back of a pub down a long alley. Then we've got the Princesses Hall in Commercial Road, which was bigger. It was actually a wedding venue. And then we had Wonderland in Whitechapel Road that could hold thousands of people. And as you can see, it was a boxing ring as well, a huge number of people. Now, so we got the Yiddish theatres and the Yiddish music halls. The Yiddish theatres, a little bit more expensive. You're going for a night out, you're seeing a whole play. The Yiddish music halls, well, that could be anything, couldn't it? It was like a song, someone whistling, someone playing around with a dog, someone doing this, all different things going on. And Der Bloffer was a satirical magazine. This is from 1911. And what this says is, Wie Jeden sitzen in a Yiddischen Theater, how Jews sit in a Yiddish theatre. So what have we got here? We have a stereotyped couple of actors on the stage. I'm sorry about the fuzzy image here. So we've got a shtetl couple on the stage, right? Sort of old-fashioned stuff. We've got an orchestra who are probably not playing together. Certainly their instruments have seen better times. In the gallery, we have the gangs that were terrorizing the East End. The Bessarabians and the Odessans were fighting each other fiercely, and we're doing a lot of it in the gallery, in between getting very drunk. And everybody else is sitting around, some in the gallery and some in the stalls, but they're not really sitting, are they? They're canoodling on beds. I mean, so this is a satirical piece that was in Der Bloffer, moaning about the sort of behavior that was happening in the music hall. So there's a lot of people also who wrote all sorts of sketches about it, but I'm not going to read you that. What I'm going to read you a bit of now is a very serious article by someone called Einer was is dort gewein, someone who was there. So they don't give their name. And they say this about the music hall. This is 1901 in der, it's actually not in der Tägliche Express, it's in der Yiddische Express. Outside the pavilion last week were posters for the Yiddish theatre with a man dressed as a woman in different poses. The play was like a pantomime, unnatural, clumsy, don't know what to call it, because it was billed as sad, but it wasn't a tragedy, it wasn't a comedy, but people were titillated to laugh. It wasn't an opera, as the melodies were very weak. Some sketches plumped together and all sung badly. In fact, it was Bar Kochba. Now, Bar Kochba was a big melodrama operetta by Goldfaden. It was totally impossible to judge the Yiddish theatre by the same measure as the non-Jewish theatre. On the non-Jewish stage, they make it as natural and close to life as possible. But here, we do it completely the opposite. We chase as far from reality as we can. Amongst Jews, people don't speak like this. They don't move their hands like the actors in the theatre do. Their sort of speaking and acting is of a totally different form, typical of the Yiddish theatre. You can live your whole life among Jews and you won't hear that form of speaking. In fact, you won't hear it until you come into the theatre. This is the sort of speech of the Purim clown and the Purim spielers. And the acting isn't anything to talk about because they don't act. They make too many hand movements and they speak as if they're stuck to one place. Their only movement being with their hand. It's not natural. The actors should go and look at real life. People doing business, crying, laughing, and do the same. And then in 1902, just one other quote. In every theatre, one is happy to play to the gallery and throw out a comic role. But this is nothing but an add-on. In the Yiddish theatre, this add-on has become the main thing. The comic role takes over the main role, and one sees that the management is more concerned with the taste of the gallery than the intelligent audience in the good seats. It might be good for business, but not for art. So you've got a sense that there's two areas really that people are complaining about. One is something about religion and the way they are, and the second one is about the quality of it. And there was a really that's what I'm going to do. I was going to give you an example now of what we're talking about when we say the word shund, which means trash, but it is a contested term. First of all, I'm going to show you exactly why and what they didn't like. Wenn die Musik, this is a song called Der Dancing School. Wenn die Musik spielt so süß, when the music plays so sweetly, heben die Mäuden die, the girls lift up there. So rhyming with süß is fies. So the girls kick up their legs, right? So when the music's playing süß, heben die Mäuden die, hence they lift up their hands. And then we've got the next verse, which goes, Rachel hat lieb zu springen hoch. Rachel likes jumping high in dem dancing school. Bis sie hat bekommen a geschwollenem, sorry, hoich in dem dancing school, bis she hat bekommen a geschwollenem, and hoich rhymes with boich till she has a swollen stomach in the dancing stool. But what does she have? A swollen foot. So you get the sense that you've got this schoolboy silly humor that you have to produce something like this, or the gangs are going to be ripping up the seats and doing all sorts of things which were not good. Now, what's important to see in this, if we go on, is that who is writing this shund? Who is writing the work that is just for that? Well, actually, it's often the same writers as are writing quality theatre. Because if you're writing quality theatre, as this shows, which is also a Bluffer cartoon, on the right we have Hamlet and we have One Man and Two Dogs, and on the left we've got Schmendrick, which is a comedy, and we've got a great big line going around the corner. So it's very, very hard to get people to go, and there was an attempt to set up a quality theatre in London called the Temple of Art, and it looked like this, with the lovely big sort of architectural grandeur, but it really didn't work very well. And here's a quote from 1912 about that. The Jewish masses are too immature or too torn up inside to be skilled enough to build a people's theatre and maintain it. And this was meant to be a people's theatre which had more quality work, which was translations of Shakespeare, which was Ibsen, which was translations of known and also like Gordon and other playwrights in Yiddish who were beginning to write quality plays. Oh, sorry about that. Hang on. Such people's institutes can only be designed by people with a healthy people's instinct, with a uniform culture, but not by Jewish people who are culturally torn and broken. Now, we're looking at around, this is before the First World War, there's a lot of workers in the East End of London, and this is partly a class rift, but it's also partly an education rift, that there are people coming in trying to educate the masses, and the masses are not always interested in being educated in that way. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to have a look at 3 songs, because what happens is, although the songs are called shund, and I couldn't find very much, I have to say, in the one in the dancing school that it tells you very much about what's going on in London, but all of these do. But all of these, even though they're can be quite serious songs, are songs that have to throw in a bit of silliness as well. So I'm going to start off by looking at London hat sich übergekehrt. So London is turned upside down. And this is by Sam Leffenwert, who was started off in Britain, and then he went over to New York later, as many of the actors and writers did. And his song is about what is different in London, what has happened. London ist nicht, wie es ist einmal gewesen. Ich in meinen jungen Jahren habe keinmal nicht gesehen, dass unter der Erde so voll at the top of the train. There was a tube train underground. That's very strange. London is a strange place, and a bus goes without a horse, and people live like all crowded together, and they're eating fish and chips. So what we have is we have a whole bunch of things that are connecting us to London, and are looking at what is it that people have to acculturate to in London. And the second verse tells us more, that it's not the same as it was. The Jews speak English. Well, the Jews in the East End speak Yiddish. The Jews that speak English were the established Jewish community, and they were like miles away, which we'll see later in another song, from what the East End Jews felt. And they gamble on the horses instead of the dogs. And the other big issue is, wer geht du in die Häusen? Who wears the trousers? The ladies, I bet. And you have to have a little titillating line, der Mann schläft auf der Erde and the lodger in bed. And the girls, of course, they're called as ice, they're out there on the streets demanding the vote. So what we have in this is all these things that London is doing, and that the East Enders have to somehow like find a way to integrate that into their lives. I'm going to whiz on because I'm aware I haven't got very long left. And this is a song called Brieflich von Russland. And this is also written at around the same time. These are all around the turn of the century. And these are letters from a woman in Russia whose husband has come to London. And we know this story, yeah? A husband comes to London, he finds a job, he finds a place, he makes some money, he sends it back, his wife and the children come over. Or they don't. Or he goes to London and he goes, oh my God, this is too much hard work. I'm going to abandon them, ignore them, leave her and Aguna, a trapped wife, back in Russia. And this is a song about that. And it's very moving. And there's a chorus that goes, Oi, die Brievelach von Russland seinen, viel mit Leiden, viel mit Schmerz, als man nimmt der Brieveler in die Hand, auf Stücke Welt zerrissen das Herz, viel mit Weinen, viel mit Tränen, gefreilich Wort wird ihr nicht hören, in die Brievelach. Russland. And people knew of this situation. This wasn't something new to people. But what this also does is you can't just have a song that's just making everyone cry, because the lads in the gallery are going to start getting nudgy. So what instead is you have this woman writing letters, and as each verse has the new letter, she gets more and more angry, and she's telling him to go to hell, and she's telling him, you know, that the children are starving, but she's yelling at him. And the sort of like way she is losing her control is something that then creates the humor in this very sort of like song that pulls at these different emotions, at very real things happening for immigrants in London. And I could be sure that people listening to this, they all would have known someone. You know, it was in the papers. This was a situation that people knew. But finally, I wanted to look at a song that concentrates on religion. And it's an absolutely fascinating song. It's called Frag Kein Kachanas. Don't ask silly questions. It was written by Oren Naga, who was a prolific playwright. Well, actually, he did write some plays, prolific songwriter. Lots of the songs he performed himself. He was a comedian, and he liked doing songs which made men look very silly. And so he was a comedian where he would be like looking daft on stage. And this song by his, the silly question of this song is, can you remain Orthodox in Britain? So you come here as an immigrant, can you remain Orthodox? And he has, that's the first character. But the second character is his neighbor. And his neighbor says to him, Frag nicht kein Kachanas, don't ask stupid questions. Es ist England. This is England. What do you think? I mean, England's a weird place. Everything's upside down. They've got weird people. They've got strange customs. There's, you know, you think that you can remain Orthodox here? And what we have then is we have 3 verses that exemplify this. And the first verse tells us, when I came over here, and I thought I was going to sit with the Rebbe in the Stiebel, in a yeshiva, and I'd sit at his table and I'd learn from him. But actually what happened was not that. I did not, it's hard to get a job in London. I had to go and work in a sweatshop. I was paid so little in that sweatshop that I have to work all day and night, or as much time as I can, including, of course, Shabbos. And his neighbor says to him, hey, mate, what do you expect? Come on, this is England. So that's the first exemplification of what's the problem with the difficulties with religion in England. The second one, and here we go now, we've got to get a bit of laughter amongst the kids in the gallery. So, well, you know, young men coming on their own have to find lodgings, and they're all lodgings, and there's all a lot of humor in the music hall about the lover climbing out the windows, the husband comes back from work, and so on. And so this is it, you know, that I'm a lodger, and my landlady is flirting with me, and I get all worked up about it, and then the husband comes back, and look what destruction was wrought. And his neighbor says, hey, listen, pal. You know, you got to pull yourself together, mate. This is England. And so we're looking at, first of all, work issues. We're looking at gender issues, if you like, or sex issues. And finally, we're looking at what is different between the East End immigrants and the established Anglo-Jews who are living in Britain. So people make shuls here. They're called cathedral synagogues, for goodness sake. I mean, they look beautiful. They're nothing like the Stiebelach and the Chevras and the little rooms that everybody is praying in. They may say that they, like, you know, do Pesach as it's meant to be done, but after the Seder, what they're eating is not only they're eating chametz, they're eating oysters, for goodness sake. It's treif, and instead of the afikoimen, they're eating pie, and on Yom Kippur they're smoking and they're eating. And the problem that this immigrant sees is, where is the Judaism in that? That's not my Judaism. So I think I'm going to stop sharing now, that what we get on the Yiddish stage, it's really interesting that we get all these issues and debates, including these little bits of, you know, shundy bits in the middle, little bits of trashy things around sex and double entendres. But essentially, we're getting stuff that is really the difficult things that people are trying to live through in London's East End. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vivi. Amazing. And I love that picture of the people in the audience. I'm just imagining all our jail audience at home in those positions. But that's such an interesting point about the kind of the grit of it, and the pain of it, alongside all the stereotypes. We've had lots and lots of questions for you coming through, but what I'm going to do, with your permission, is hold them back, bring Edna on first, and then we'll address them to you both. So I'm going to look forward to seeing Vivi again in a few minutes. But before we take some of your questions, let's just do a comparison with what was happening in New York, and then we'll begin to dive in to some of those issues. So if we, instead of Vivi, we bring Edna on screen. Let me just ask Emma to do that. There we go. And let me introduce Edna to all of you before I hand over to her. So Dr. Edna Nahshon is Professor of Theatre and Drama at JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary. Her speciality is that intersection of Jewishness, theatre and performance, and she's written extensively about Yiddish theatre. Her most recent book, and I think she's going to show it to us, is Wrestling with Shylock, Jewish Responses to the Merchant of Venice, which I know many of us who've been watching the West End stage recently will have questions about. Edna's publications and career highlights are just way too numerous for me to mention, so I'll pull out just one that's particularly relevant to tonight's discussion. In 2016, Dr. Nahshon curated the highly successful exhibition New York's Yiddish Theatre, from the Bowery to Broadway, for the Museum of the City of New York. It was an amazing exhibition that ran for several months, and it was accompanied by a book of the same title with Dr. Nahshon as contributing editor. And that book was selected as the recipient of the 2016 George Friedley Award Special Jury Prize for an exemplary work in the field of live theatre or performance. So we're so delighted to have you with us, Dr. Nahshon, and to go from Whitechapel to Broadway. So over to you.
Thank you. Hello from New York. Let me just see if I have share screen. Yes. All right. So this is on a more serious note. Every live theater production dialogues with the present, whether deliberately so or inadvertently. Contemporary productions of the classic, be it Ibsen or Shakespeare, attest to this timeliness. Take, for example, a production that I have not seen but read about a lot, Tracy Ann Oberman's new stage interpretation of The Merchant of Venice, in which Shylock has been refigured as a woman, and the action is set against the background of fascism in the 1936 Battle of Cable Street. Oberman is not the first nor the last theater artist who talks back to Shylock, a fictional character who has served for many generations as a sort of litmus test for the way the Gentile world interpreted the Jew, and more recently, for the way Jews interpreted themselves and their position within Gentile society. Today, I will discuss a major Yiddish theatrical reworking of the Shylock story, Let me just go to share screen. Okay. Titled Shylock and His Daughter, or in Yiddish, Shylock und seine Tochter, the work retold the story of the Merchant of Venice from an entirely Jewish perspective. Shylock and His Daughter opened on September 30, 1947, in New York City at Maurice Schwartz's acclaimed Yiddish Art Theater, with Schwartz as producer, dramatist, director, and star, and Charlotte Goldstein in the role of Jessica, his daughter. As I mentioned, Shylock and His Daughter opened in 1947 in the highly respected Yiddish Art Theater that Maurice Schwartz built years earlier. It was a lavish production enhanced by music by Joseph Rumshinsky, the foremost composer of the Yiddish theater in America, and elaborate sets designed by James E. Hotchkiss. And it was hailed by critics and beloved by the public. It played for the entire season, which was quite unusual for the Yiddish theater, toured major U.S. cities, and remained in the company's repertory until its demise in 1950 or thereabout. The Yiddish play was based on a Hebrew language novel, Shylock, the Jew of Venice, published in Palestine in 1947. Here you see it. This presents us with an intriguing linguistic and cultural triad consisting of, obviously, Shakespeare's original, a modern Hebrew novel grounded in the Shakespearean text, and an American Yiddish dramatized version of the novel. If we add to this list the Yiddish and later English translation of the novel and of the play, this is the play, this is the novel, renamed in English Jessica, My Daughter, we witness a fascinating trilingual combination here that is well worth noting, and we could discuss it for an hour or two, but this is not the focus of my discussion. What I want to focus on today are two themes. First, Shylock and His Daughter as a product of its time, that is to say, as a post-Holocaust work. And the second, the play's depiction of Jessica, who was assigned an unprecedented central role in the Hebrew Yiddish version of the play. Here you can see Shylock and Jessica, the very young actress who died just a couple of years ago, when she was almost 100 years old, the last great Yiddish actress. Shylock and His Daughter was not a run-of-the-mill Yiddish adaptation of Shakespeare. It is very different from the oft-ridiculed old Yiddishized appropriations of Shakespeare, such as Hamlet, the Yeshiva Bocher. What we have here is a work that boldly defines itself, not as an adaptation, but as a countertext to a revered work by the world's most hallowed dramatist. Such enterprises are usually associated with the counter-discourses of feminism and post-colonialism, where countertexts serve to unveil and dismantle the basic assumptions of a canonical work by preserving many of the familiar elements of the original tale while altering the structure of power. By hinging themselves onto well-known works, countertexts assert both a deep connectedness to and a critique of the cultural system that fostered the original work. Often, theatrical countertexts achieve this goal by use of parody, subversive theatrical nonverbal language, and meta-theatrical devices such as play within a play. Literary measures include deletions and repositioning of parts of the original text, and the addition of prequels and sequels. The most direct challenge to the canonical text, however, is presented by the juxtaposition of a mirror countertext of the same genre. Such exemplars are few, and when it comes to Shakespeare, the practice used to be regarded as an act of cultural audacity, and that's a very kind word. Shylock and His Daughter was a work created in the context of the monumental rupture created by the Holocaust and the subsequent shattered trust in the superiority and ultimate moral goodness of Western culture. After the Holocaust, Jews in particular felt betrayed by the promise of the civilizing nature of the arts and their innate power to improve humanity. It proved to be a promise that crumbled before the chilling reality of mass murderers with a cultivated taste for classical music and poetry. The Merchant of Venice, more than any other work of fiction, encapsulated the nexus of high culture and the heritage of anti-Semitism. In the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, the play commanded two major types of Jewish responses. One was a wish for the play's total excision from the cultural repertoire. Thus, for example, in 1947, the Jewish community in Frankfurt, composed mostly of survivors, exerted immense moral pressure and succeeded in calling off a planned production of The Merchant of Venice at the city's municipal theater. Earlier that year, American impresario Lee Shubert requested that the British Donald Wolfett Shakespearean Company, then on tour in the United States, not present The Merchant of Venice in New York for, and I quote, "it might prove offensive to Jews," end quote. A different type of response aimed not to eliminate, but to radically correct. It argued against anti-Semitic portrayals of Shylock as a paradigmatic Jew and sought to amend Shakespeare to reflect the Jewish historical narrative to, quote, set the record straight, unquote, and tell it like it really was. It was this approach that propelled the production of Shylock and His Daughter. As mentioned earlier, the production must be considered within the framework of the major issues of the historical moment. By 1947, the Nuremberg trials of major war criminals had been completed, and the full dimensions of the Holocaust had become officially known. Calls for Nekome, vengeance, and stories about Jewish avengers roaming the European landscape had much currency. It may have ignited the imagination of some, but in the meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors were languishing in displaced person camps, barred from moving out of Europe due to British restrictions to immigration to Palestine. In fact, in 1947, same year as our production, the world held its breath at the trials and tribulations of passengers of the ship Exodus, most of them Holocaust survivors, as they prevented by the British authorities from disembarking at the Haifa airport and were sent back to Europe. Increased Arab attacks in Palestine, British execution of Jewish underground fighters, especially of Dov Gruner, the Holocaust survivor, and the near messianic hope for the establishment of Jewish sovereignty, especially after the UN approval of the partition plan on November 29, 1947, evoked an intense emotional engagement in the Yiddish-speaking community. And you can see here, welcome UN delegates. This is near the production of the play. Last but not least, in our consideration of Shylock and His Daughter, we need to consider the changing profile of post-war American Jewry. and the emergence of a new generation of native-born English-speaking Jews who were moving out of the immigrant Yiddish-speaking milieu and were negotiating their way in Gentile America. They understood Yiddish, but their children and definitely their grandchildren would not. Morris Schwartz, the leading theater person in the interwar period, was personally invested in these issues. In 1947, shortly before the opening of the new theater season, he had toured Europe's DP camps and was deeply moved by what he saw. Though he never had any children, he adopted two sibling child survivors whom he and his wife would raise as their own. Approaching his 60th birthday, he had reached a point in his life where he was thinking of the future and of legacy in both personal and artistic terms, fully aware of the historic and demographic changes that were having an irreversible impact on the Yiddish theater that had been his life's work. For despite artistic renown and recognized communal standing, his Yiddish art theater was struggling to survive as the numbers of Yiddish speakers was eroding, a problem he had addressed 2 years earlier when he noted in a souvenir program for another play, the masses have become linguistically assimilated, estranged from our Yiddish language, our literature, and our theater. With Shylock and his daughter, Schwartz was a man on a mission. The mission was to clear the Jewish name and to transmit certain values to a new generation of American Jews. The latter was demonstrated in his decision to publish the English translation of the play in book form and have it sold in the box office. Although New York's Yiddish playbooks had always supplied an English language synopsis, such a publishing enterprise had never been attempted before, to the best of my knowledge. It attests to Schwartz's realistic assessment of the linguistic and cultural changes that typify the post-war generation. By providing Americanized Jew with a text they could read and share with future generations, he tried to safeguard against the erasure of Jewish memory by a rapid process of cultural assimilation. Now to the author of the novel. Ari Ibn Zahav, the author of the novel on which the play was based, and who is officially named as the author of the play, though it was completely reworked by Boy Schwartz, was about 10 years younger than Schwartz. He was born in Poland in 1899 by the name of Leo Goldstein, studied in Leipzig before immigrating to Palestine in 1922, where he was soon appointed academic secretary of the newly founded Hebrew University, a job he held until he left for New York to collaborate with Schwartz on the production. According to Ibn Zahav, he was influenced in his work on the Shylock Project by his anguish over the rise and expansion of Hitlerism. In an essay titled Shylock of Honor, Not Shame, which he published in Hebrew at the time of the 1947 production, he explained his mindset when he wrote his Shylock novel as follows. As reports keep arriving from the ghettos and the death camps, they make your head spin and you despise yourself for not sitting shiva day and night, for not tearing your flesh and clothes in mourning, and you wonder how is it that you have not gone mad and are not acting frantically as every bereaved animal would, and you remain silent with a feeling of helplessness and disgust with those who were created in the image of God and sermonize about freedom and democracy and justice and mercy. Ibn Zahav's engagement with the play began at the scholarly level. In 1942, he published a quasi-academic essay in a Hebrew University publication in which he pointed out some major discrepancies and inconsistencies in the Shakespearean text and argued that the play as we know it was a composite of two earlier texts. His essay demonstrates his thorough familiarity with the academic literature on the Merchant of Venice, as well as with Jewish Italian life and customs of the period. The latter, by the way, served him well in authoring his novel, as his argument was that had Shakespeare been familiar with the historical facts of Jewish life in Venice, he would not have portrayed Shylock in the same manner. Ibn Zahab's revisionary strategy was more scholarly than inspired, with an emphasis on historical pedantry and authentic details of everyday life, including a fair number of footnotes, which the English translator wisely omitted. The central conflict of the tale was Jessica's inner struggle between Jewishness, represented by the depressing prison-like ghetto, and the glamorous freedom offered by Gentile Venice. Ibn Zahab historicized the tale by setting the action in the year 1559 and introduced into the narrative recorded historical events such as the proceedings against the Marranos in Ancona, of whom 25 were burned at the stake. He also added historical figures such as Pope Paul IV, whose career as head of the Inquisition and his 4-year tenure as Pope were marked by extreme anti-Jewish measures that included the burning of the Talmud in 1553 and the closing of synagogues, segregation of Jews in mandatory ghettos, and the imposition of extreme economic sanctions. Ibn Zahab also worked into the plot such Jewish historical figures as Rabbi Benjamin Nehemiah ben El-Natan, who along with 5 other community members was arrested in 1559 on the charge of being implicated in the conversion of a Catholic priest and was sent to trial in Rome, and 2 Venetian Jews, physician and scholar Kalonymus ben Judah and Chief Rabbi Abraham Romano. In his Judaizing project, he also altered and eliminated some of the original dramatis persona of the play and deleted this whole business with Portia's suitors. They no longer exist, and the business with the caskets. This is out. He rewrote Portia and Antonio as an older married couple, eager to see Jessica converted to Christianity. Here you have the actress who played Dean Halpern, who played Portia. Shylock was upgraded from usurer to the head of his own banking firm and an important communal leader, totally committed to Jewish rescue and welfare operations. Jessica, in contrast to her immigrant father, is Venetian-born, a beautiful and well-mannered young woman who never steals from her father, and like other girls of her generation is pining for the beauty and poetry of her native city. She now has 2 suitors, not just one, Lorenzo, an impoverished Christian aristocrat who serves as the required Gentile supervisor of Shylock's bank, and Samuel Morrow, on the left, a devout and learned young Marrano who returned to Judaism, a fugitive from Ancona, who finds refuge in Shylock's home. Jessica wrestles with the 2 binaries they represent. Morrow offers oppressive ghetto living and stories of martyrdom, as well as total devotion to Judaism and Hebrew learning. Lorenzo offers romantic gondola rides, poetry and music, gracious living, beautiful palazzos, and freedom from oppression. As she's torn between Venice and the ghetto, Jessica is filled with some sort of heroic spirit and decides to go to Rome on a mission of rescue to save Rabbi Benjamin and his fellow Jewish prisoners who are rotting in the dungeons of the Inquisition. In Rome, she meets with the tortured Jewish prisoners who look like death camp inmates and brings about their release. Yet as soon as this heroine, who has just put her life on the line to help her people, is back in Venice, she succumbs to Lorenzo's seduction. Confused and dazed by Venetian opulence, she converts and marries Lorenzo. Here we have her being prepared for the wedding, and here's the wedding itself. In the meantime, Antonio has lost his ships and is unable to repay his loan. Shylock, devastated by his daughter's desertion, sets out to avenge himself and the humiliation of all Jews. He calls for the payoff of the bond. The famous trial scene takes place. But unlike the Shakespearean original, the Duke decides in Shylock's favor. Though he's consumed by hate and vengefulness, Shylock does not get his pound of flesh, but only because when the moment comes, he's unable to carry out the deed and stick the knife into Antonio's flesh. He nearly collapses, braces himself, and groans, "To hell, I can't do it, I'm a Jew." Morris Schwartz climaxed his dramatization with the news about Jessica's suicide, delivered by Samuel Morrow, now Shylock's adopted son and heir. Schwartz, by the way, was not an academic pedant like Ibn Zahav and did not hesitate to Yiddishize the script and make it relevant to his audience. He included numerous allusions to Jewish food and holidays, staged religious rituals and prayers, and added various oblique references to the current Jewish concern. Nowhere is the allusion to the Holocaust as obvious as in Shylock's final grand speech when he prepares to cut out Antonio's flesh. And this is what he says, and it may sound familiar to some of you. For the martyrs put to death by Torquemada, for those buried alive in prison graves, for those who died in the Inquisition flames, for all the innocent souls who had been tortured, strangled, drowned, slain by the sword, for the theft of our children's soul, for the honor of Israel trampled in the dust by viciousness and brutality, I raise my hand in vengeance. The introduction that appeared in the playbill makes the Holocaust connection even more obvious. And here is what it says, literally. I just copied it from the program. All this occurred in Italy during the famed Renaissance period, when art and science prospered as much as in latter-day Germany. Although, of course, without the same German thoroughness and technique of the 20th century. And it went on to say, Paul IV period was a small-scale precursor of Hitler's time, and the Nuremberg laws were practically a copy of Paul's Roman edicts against the Jews. A description of the time is almost a replica of the anti-Jewish practices of our own day. But what about Jessica? Shylock's daughter, the other Jew in the play, has often been seen as a sort of flat and not terribly interesting character who flees her father's oppression. However, as Shylock began to be regarded not merely as a villain, but as a victim of prejudice, his daughter's action appeared increasingly distasteful, even to a non-Jewish audience. She steals her father's money, desecrates her mother's memory by exchanging the engagement ring she had given her husband for a pet monkey, converts to Christianity, and joins the camp of her father's tormentors. No wonder Israel Zangwill, labeled her, and I quote, the most detestable and least Jewish character in all of fiction, end quote, and called for the part to be rewritten. Indeed, as Shylock's tragedy becomes more pronounced, there was a growing need to achieve a measure of poetic justice for Jessica. In his 1931 sequel novel, The Last Days of Shylock, Ludwig Lewisohn had all Shylock reunited in Turkey with his lost daughter, now a single mother of 3 boys with bitter memories of her worthless husband. She has her boys circumcised, and they all return to Judaism. Schwartz, and I can give you quite a few other examples of this sort. Schwartz's 1947 play ends with Jessica, who, being legally forbidden to return to Judaism, commits suicide by drowning herself in the canal that leads to the ghetto. Jessica's romantic life, her problematic relationship with her father, and her abandonment of Judaism stood at the heart of Shylock and his daughter. While her father, an immigrant to Venice, stands for traditional Jewish values, she, a native-born Venetian, becomes the locus of the complexity of the modern hyphenated Jew, as imagined, in this case, by 2 older men born in Eastern Europe. One a Zionist, that's Ibn Zahav, the other an American Yiddishist, Schwartz. It is through her that the extreme binaries of ghetto and Gentile society are discussed. In this manner, Ibn Zahav and Schwartz gender the question of assimilation. The assimilated Jew, in this view, becomes effeminate, and his efforts are doomed, as exemplified by Jessica's suicide. When Jessica is at her most Jewish and courageously goes on her dangerous mission of rescue, she behaves, as they used to say, like a man. But when she succumbs to Lorenzo and the aestheticism of Venice, she falls into the trope of a weak, confused female. This is not only an inversion of the anti-Semitic trope that saw the diaspora male Jew as effeminate, but also an inversion of the standard view that regarded women as transmitters of Jewish religion and culture. In the play, one of the characters comments that all the young Venetian Jewesses are hankering for the thrills and worldly pleasure outside the ghetto, defining Jessica's affair with the Christian world as both gendered and generational. In the playbill introduction, Schwartz contemporizes Jessica in the same vein, explaining that she was, and I quote, she was a daughter of the ghetto, longing for the enchanted city of Venice, and capable of falling in love with Lorenzo, like any other Jewish girl of our time might. So Ibn Zahav and Schwartz put a grave accusation at the door of young American Jewish women, regarding them as agents of national and religious laxity, as erotic and weak creatures who yield to romantic claptrap and material temptations, and who are responsible for the decline of the Jewish commitment and fortitude. Moreover, they offer Shylock a measure of parental compensation. In the process of his ordeal, he loses a daughter, but gains a son and heir in the person of Samuel Morrow, a devoted Jew who will continue his adoptive father's work and will undoubtedly say Kaddish after him when he dies. Thus, even within this Jewish talkback, the only Jewish female in the tale is eliminated, leaving the command of Jewish life to men who are responsible leaders and fully aware of the challenging task of maintaining Jewish survival. I'm almost done.
I know.
When Ibn Zahav novel while Ibn Zahav novel had a very clear Zionist message, what could Schwartz present to an audience going through a rapid process of Americanization? Ibn Zahav could offer Palestine, but Schwartz could not suggest a return to the ghetto of the Lower East Side. All he could propose was a feeble plea for ethnic pride and a call to the young to be tolerant and understanding of their parents, even if they considered them excessively sectarian and narrow-minded. Ibn Zahav's dream was that the play be produced on the Israeli stage. It never materialized. Israeli society, then busy with creating its icon of the Sabra, had no use for a rehabilitated Venetian usurer. As for the Yiddish art theater, it could not sustain itself after 1950. In 1960, while working in Israel on a production of Kiddush Hashem, Morris Schwartz suffered a massive heart attack and passed away. The dream of a Yiddish art theater dying with him. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that really unexpected and thorough discussion of The Merchant of Venice, which I know many of us are thinking about at the moment. I'm going to pick that up. We don't have much time for Q&A, but let me just pick that up very quickly in our Q&A and bring Vivi in, because Edna, you were addressing the Yiddish production of Merchant in America in 1947, but in fact in 1946 there was one in London, and it also had a father and daughter, Meir and Anna Salnica. So I have two
tried to
questions.
find more information about the production. I'll greatly appreciate it because I couldn't find.
I researched it for the British Library. Unfortunately, they're under cyber attack, but when their website is back online, there should be material. I'll share it. But one of the things I was going to ask, well, there are two questions coming out of it. Meir and Anna are obviously also father and daughter, although in that case she played Portia, he played Shylock. It wasn't her playing Jessica like in America. But I think it's really interesting that there were these family dynamics within the Yiddish theatre. So that's question one coming out of that, is to what extent there were family relationships. And we've had questions in the chat, how did people get into being actors in the Yiddish theatre? And question number two coming out of that, so that certainly the production in London was directed by Robert Atkins, who wasn't Jewish, which is a really fascinating thing. We had a question in the chat from Marion Janner, who asked about whether the Yiddish theatre faced any hostility from non-Jews. Were there ever Yiddish plays in English? Did non-Jews come as audiences? So I'm going to take both those things out of that. Number one, the family dynamics and how people got into being in the Yiddish theatre. And number two, the relationship with non-Jews.
How about we start with the last question?
Okay, start with the last question and then I'll bring Vivi in.
There was no hostility whatsoever. The Yiddish theater was definitely an important part of the theater scene in New York. Productions were routinely covered by all newspapers, none whatsoever. And in fact, I have to tell you something a little almost funny. When I was researching this production, the photographs were at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts. So I went in there. It was sort of the inner sanctum in order to look at the photographs, you had to put on white gloves and you could only use a pencil and so on and so forth. And one of the assistants went to get the photographs. She comes back and I'm being called and I see this tall, older Black woman who must have been a dancer, I mean, from the way she moved. And she holds it, she looks at it and she says, "This is Morris Schwartz." And I look at her and I said, "How do you know?" I said, "Oh, we used to go see him all the time." Now, I never managed to catch up with her again. I asked about it time and again, and last time I asked, I was told she passed. but I assume she was in a studio of some sort with a group of actors. I mean, just plain people did not go much to the Yiddish theater, but actors did. And Brooks Atkinson, who was the major theater critic in New York at the time, adored Morris Schwartz. He thought he was simply the best there is, that the American theater was very anemic in comparison with the theater that he created. So nothing negative to say here.
Okay,
So
let's take that one
family,
before we go on to
okay,
families. Let's bring Vivian in on that
sure.
one and the non-Jewish relationship to the London Yiddish theatre.
So, I mean, it's an interesting question because generally I think that the Yiddish theatre there didn't have really antagonism from the non-Jewish world. The main antagonism it had was from the Jewish world. So the arguments that were happening within the theatre were amongst different parts of the Jewish community. There were key moments, I think, in the London Yiddish theatre, which really struck the non-Jewish world, who then clamoured into the theatre. And I think that there are three key pieces. One is the one that you said, the Robert Atkins production of The Merchant of Venice. The other one was The King of Lampedusa at the Grand Palais in 1943. And the other one was the opening of the Temple of Art in 1912, I think it was, of Rigoletto in Yiddish. And each of these productions had like really hit the British press. And then you had a lot of non-Jewish people coming, and as soon as one like standard would then pull something out, then you got really a lot of people coming. So it became that, and people wouldn't have understood Yiddish, and they weren't just Jews coming who were sort of like outside the community, outside of the Yiddish community, but it was also a non-Jewish audience because obviously theatre is big in London. So I think that I haven't particularly heard of any specific aggression between Jews and non-Jews. Mainly it's between the Anglo-Jewish authority and the Yiddish immigrants, or between different ideological positions. But there were key moments, I think, where the Yiddish theatre suddenly came to the attention of the English theatre. But one other thing to say is that I think the Yiddish theatre got away with things that the English theatre couldn't. So, of course, we have the Lord Chamberlain's office who are censoring plays. And that is the main theatre. But in the music hall, the censorship was slightly different. And I'm sorry, it's a little bit on an angle, this, but the censorship was about if people complained about something. If there was a complaint, they'd come and they'd inspect the theatre, and then they might close it down or whatever. And I just have this sense by some of the material that you get in the Yiddish theatre in London that they managed to sort of slip through some of the censorship, because you do get some rather crude stuff, which I don't think you get. You get it more innuendoed. In fact, Jackie Bratton, who wrote about the music hall in Britain, was talking about how that those inspections really helped the theatre because people had to think of other ways to innuendo information. So sorry, that's and what you want to say about family dynamics. It was really important in the Yiddish theatre that people married into other people in the Yiddish theatre, because it's like being a woman on your own, traveling, not with someone was a danger. And so people would keep their families close with them, and they'd marry into the Yiddish theatre, and that's why you get a lot of these the family relationships. And certainly Maya and Anna were extremely close. And I mean, you know, Anna was sort of like would talk about Maya a lot, talk about her father, and of course she wrote a wonderful book called Three for the Price of One, I think it is, isn't it? Yeah,
Fantastic, thank you. And Edna, the same is true in America,
Well,
is it?
most serious Yiddish plays are transpire within a family structure. But the truth is that many of our non-Yiddish plays do the same. This is the basic human structure, and this is where things happen. So, I mean, you can call King Lear also a family drama. So this is a given. I have to say one more thing, that in the Yiddish theater in New York, there were also some actors who were not Jewish, and I'm not talking about minor actors. And they came from the German stage because New York had a thriving German theater up until about the end of World War I, and also attended by many Jews. And I saw an article where they already complained that they're losing audiences. These are people who knew German to the Yiddish theater. And when there are all these anti-German sentiments after the First World War, you do have a few actors who switch from the German stage to the Yiddish stage, where they can also make a lot more money and where they have stable employment. Joseph Schildkraut is a typical example for this. He started in the German stage. His Yiddish was good, but not wonderful. He had to work on it, and he becomes a major performer in the Yiddish theater. So in New York, I think, unlike London, you also have to think of the Yiddish theater within a larger framework of ethnic theaters and the relationship between them. And I would maintain that at some point, the relationship with the German theater in New York was much stronger than with the American theater, with the English language theater.
Absolutely
So,
fascinating.
and there was an Italian theater, and there was a Chinese theater, and there's some connections there, but especially with the German because of the linguistic affinity that and the heavy number of Jews who are part of it.
I would like
Fantastic.
to make
Last word, Vivi.
I'd like to make one comment though about that there were Jewish actors, obviously, in the English theatre. And in fact, there was a furious article in the Yiddish press by a man called Finkelstein, who was talking about how Jewish actors, for Anglo-Jewish actors in the English theatre, were stereotyping Jews, and that the Jewish theatres were demanding that sort of stereotype, and they were bringing in Jewish actors to do that, and they were feeling that this was actually fueling anti-Semitism, fueling stereotypes. So, I mean, in a way, there's not the Yiddish theatre, but within the English theatre, there's some tension there.
It's fascinating. We're going to have to bring it to a close. I'm so sorry, but we've hit 8:45. But it sounds like there's a lot to continue on the discussion. So I hope we will do that in other ways in future. I'm going to hand over to Emma just to do the thank yous and advertise next week. Emma.
Yeah, so thank you so much to both of you for being here with us and sharing your different expertise. It was great to hear a little snippet of Whitechapel song from Vivi and that very kind of in-depth journey through Merchant of Venice in New York. So thank you very much to both of you. And as Aviva said, our series continues next week with a session that we've called Writing in Yinglish. So we're looking at two, from the historical to the contemporary, we're looking at two contemporary British writers and poets. And Sophie's also an artist. So we've got Sophie Herxheimer, who's an artist and poet, and we've got Michael Rosen, who is a poet and a children's author. And they will be discussing the influence of Yiddish in their writing in English. So do join us, same time next week. And yeah, good to see you, and thank you again to all of you and to everyone for coming.
Thank you for putting on the series.